So in this section, we're going to focus on a couple things. Number one, we're going to focus on roles and responsibilities. This has to do with picking, engaging with the right departments, different people within the team, training them. Next, we'll focus on the transition methods that you have the option to elect when transitioning, practical expedients, judgments and assumptions, and then we'll talk about classification criteria. Now, for roles and responsibilities, as with any new standard, it's definitely a team effort to get this implemented. There are many departments that are going to be involved in the process, and you'll need to collaborate with them to make sure you're capturing all of your lease data, that it's complete, that it's accurate, and that your calculations are correct. So a good first step is to identify the departments that are going to be involved in the process, and then also identifying what their responsibilities are. So documenting this within your policies: who's involved, what are their responsibilities. Once you've identified the different departments involved, you also want to establish key personnel with each department and determine what their responsibilities are. And as you're doing this, there may be certain skills that these personnel need to learn. So you want to document what new skills you're going to teach your employees so they can assist, that they're well educated when it comes to ASC 842. Which brings me to my next point: create a training plan and document it. So you're going to have to, providing education and training to your employees on ASC 842 is extremely valuable. Now, when it comes to education, there are a few things I'm going to mention here that you can educate your team on, and this may vary depending on the role of the employees involved in the process and what their responsibilities are. But number one is, lease terms. So, and when I mean lease terms, like the definition of lease-related items, for example, embedded leases. It's important to know what an embedded lease is and how to look for them, what borrowing rates are, lease classifications, and the differences between operating and finance leases. Materiality, and some of these things we're going to talk about in more detail in a moment, but what your materiality thresholds are so they can use that information when collecting your lease data, calculations, practical expedients, what they mean. So these are just briefly some of the things that you could educate your team on, and again, it's going to depend on their role in the process, but in preparing this training plan, you're going to want to document this. I may recommend a training booklet, so you can have everything that you're going to teach your employees based on, related to ASC 842. And then after your employees have gone through the training process, they can sign it, saying that, we've gone through this training process, we understand what's going on, and we're ready to start, collecting lease data. This is important because, when I used to be an auditor, I would also always look for corroborating evidence that, if a company's saying their employees are well educated on a certain standard, it's valuable to know what you've done or the company's done to educate their employees. So if you have a training plan, a booklet, and signed and documented by your employees, you can definitely go a long way when your auditors take a look at that. So that's it when it comes to roles and responsibilities. I know, Sarah, you've gone through this process with your prior company. Is there anything else that you would add to this section or anything that I missed?
Yeah, Jaron, I think you've got most of it there. I think one thing that I would just kind of add, especially when you talked about training and everything, is one of the things that your auditors are going to be looking for is not only that you implemented 842 appropriately and got through that okay, but there's also going to be ongoing, accounting for leases under 842 and well into the future, obviously. So having that kind of thing documented somewhere that shows how you really did train up your other departments and your colleagues and the associates that touch the lease process will help to provide some comfort and support to your auditors that it is going to be covered not just on day one of adoption, but for the future.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sarah. I appreciate you bringing that up. So for the next section of the webinar today is transition methods. So when transitioning to ASC 842, there are two methods you can elect from: the effective date method and the comparative method. So the effective method allows a lessee to apply the new lease accounting standard on a prospective basis. And what that means is that when transitioning to the operating leases to ASC 842, you will pick up the lease obligations as of your transition date. So there's no restating prior or comparative financials. Now, by adopting this method, it means there's no need for historical lease information. So that's so you don't have to go back into prior years and figure out what you paid in order to restate. And this is valuable to have in your policies ahead of time, because when your employees are collecting lease data, they'll need to know, how far do I need to go back in my lease portfolio with historical information when collecting this data. And that will really be determined based on what method you've chosen. And then there's the comparative method. So this method is where you retrospectively apply the new lease accounting standard of ASC 842 to the earliest comparative balance sheet, or the earliest comparative financial statements. So it will require historical lease information, which in turn will impact the amount of work that goes in for your employees when looking for lease information. So you want to choose which method you're going with, and also document the reasoning behind your decision within your policy, so your auditors know, like, if I went with the effective method, it's probably because I wanted to save time, lower the expense of transition, we didn't have historical data, something along those lines. Or if you needed comparative method, document the reasoning behind that. So those are the two methods. You'll want to document those for the purpose of, for your policies, but also these will need to be disclosed in the financial statements at year end. So those are a few things that you'll want to consider. All right, so to keep this thing moving along, we'll talk about judgment and assumptions next. So here, the main thing I wanted to focus on is renewal options, termination options, and purchase options, mainly because they have a big impact on, the terms of your lease. So when it comes to renewal options, these types of things, you're going to want to consider what is going to impact your conclusion on whether something is reasonably certain to be exercised, because this will in turn impact your lease term and then your present value calculation. So a lot of impact here. So you'll want to document your policies for your reasonably certain options. So if you have a renewal option, what is your company going to consider there? Well, some factors that I would consider, this isn't all inclusive, but for renewal option, is the option to renew is the asset unique? So is the location also, it's great for your company, it would be terrible to move, you're very profitable in that area, would it be hard to replace? Then you probably renew that, or be one of the factors you'd include. The availability of comparative assets. For real estate leases, you want to consider the cost of moving. For equipment leases, you want to consider the cost of disruption to operations. Sometimes you want to consider contractual terms. So what are the payments for your renewal period? Is it, a good deal? So those are some options you would, consider when determining whether options are reasonably certain. And similar for purchase options, really that you're concerned with the price of the purchase option. Is it a good deal? Is it a bargain purchase option? And then for termination options, certain things you consider, there's termination fees. If you really like the asset, you're probably not likely to terminate or exercise that option. So whatever decisions you go with when determining what's reasonably certain, just be clear within your documentation and your policies, so auditors can refer back to those when they're auditing your numbers and looking at your lease terms to determine whether they're accurate and represented accurately for your calculations. Next thing we'll talk about today is classification criteria. So this is going to be an area of scrutiny as we transition to ASC 842, because all operating leases are now hitting the balance sheet. Finance leases hitting the balance sheet. So classification of the lease is going to impact the accounting. So operating leases are accounted for differently than finance leases, although they're both hitting your balance sheet. You also want to consider, like, your short-term leases. That is a classification that will, impact the accounting, because there will be no balance sheet impact of short-term leases. So we're going to talk about specifically classifying leases as operating or finance. So when you're determining what type of classification it is, you're going to consider transfer of ownership, bargain purchase option, lease terms, present value, specialized in nature. So these are the 5 tests that will be performed. If the lease meets one of these tests, then it's going to be a finance lease. So first, transfer of ownership. Is there a bargain purchase option? Is there a purchase option that's reasonably certain to be exercised? If that's a yes, it's a finance lease. Lease term. So if the lease term is the major part of the remaining economic life of an underlying asset, then it would be considered a finance lease, unless the commencement date of the lease falls at or near the end of the economic life. Now, one thing I want to point out here, so from ASC 840 to 842, these tests didn't change a lot. The testing criteria is very similar. The only thing that changed is when it comes to lease term and present value. So under ASC 840, there was a bright line threshold that said, you know, if the lease term was greater than 75% of the remaining useful life, then it would be a finance lease. Under ASC 842, it doesn't provide that threshold or clear bright line. However, under ASC 842-10-55-2, it states that we can continue to use the 75% threshold when determining the present value or determining the classification of the lease. So here you could see how there could be some judgment involved here, especially if you decided not to use the 75%. You definitely want to provide reasoning behind your threshold for your auditors to review within your policies there. So when you're determining what threshold you're going to use, make sure to document the reasoning behind that. When it comes to present value calculations, similar to the old standard, you know, not a lot had changed, but the threshold is now not stated in the ASC 842 standard. Under the old standard, if the present value of future lease payments is greater than 90% of the fair value of the asset, then it would be considered a finance lease. Again, under the standard, it states that companies can continue to use that threshold if whichever direction you go in, whether it's using the threshold stated or coming up with your own threshold, you'll want to document the reasoning behind that within your policies. And then finally is the specialized nature. So if there's an asset that you've had, you know, built specifically for your company's or your company's business, and that it would have no alternative use to the lessor, then it would be considered a finance lease. Again, this is probably going to be a big area of scrutiny during the audit process, as a lot of people are transitioning. So it'd be very important to document your policies when it comes to classifying your leases correctly.